That's great. Thanks, Ronaldo. So yes, that snapshot by Ronaldo captures much of the tone of this presentation. Before I start, I do want to say that these are my personal views. I am a professor at University College London and chair of the User-Centered Energy Systems TCP, but I'm not speaking on behalf of that technology collaboration program, its executive committees or their member countries. And this is certainly not something that should be seen as in any way part of sort of under the auspices of the International Energy Agency. So it's really reflections of mine that have grown over the course of the last kind of 9 months. But I think they have implications for how the energy transition progresses. So with caveats aside, I shall move on. So this slide, this photo to the right-hand side was something sent to me by a colleague, and it neatly encapsulated the kind of point of much of this talk, I think. It's clearly a poorly translated Japanese sign. I think it's supposed to say the furniture is dangerous, but it just happens to capture a lot of what seems to be happening in the world at the moment, and particularly what seems to be a dominant narrative from geopolitical strategists working outside of the energy area. There seems to be an emerging consensus that what we have experienced over the last 30 years is going to be very different from what we are likely to experience over the next 20, which is really the period that takes us through to our aims to achieve zero carbon by 2050. For me, I think the conclusion is that while we talk much about climate tipping points and feedback loops, particularly around issues of rapid release of methane from the Arctic tundra or a range of effects that could accelerate climate change itself, we haven't talked about the social dynamics which make achieving consensus around acting on climate change. We haven't talked about those or how they themselves might change as a result of a range of factors. And this is what this talk focuses on. It's really less about feedback effects in the climate, although climate plays an important role, but looking more broadly at our global capacity to reach and sustain a consensus to act. So to summarize this, and this is building on what Ronaldo introduced. So the argument broadly is that there are 4 converging crises. The first of which is a geopolitical crisis. There is a sense, and you'll see this fairly widely in the media and elsewhere, that we are going through a phase of deglobalization. We had a strong globalization phase, during which time we offshored a lot of manufacturing and chased lowest cost production for supply chains of goods and materials. That appears to be coming to an end for a range of factors. And we are seeing a world that is becoming more ideologically multipolar or probably bipolar, really. So we're seeing a split between liberal democratic world values and ones that could be described as sort of autocratic or authoritarian. So that has been greatly accelerated by the Ukraine crisis, but has been an ongoing shift we've seen for a while. The impact of this is to make reaching global consensus more difficult, it is inflationary because we are looking to reshore supply chains and build in resilience. It will result in the globe not being as economically productive, so we will effectively be poorer than we would be in a globalized world. That will be highly differential across different countries, of course. But these factors are going to fuel the growth of populism in many regions as we deglobalize. Now, if that sounds radical, this is a report from the National Intelligence Council of the US. So if you've not seen it, this is one of my must-reads. It's a document produced for the election of every new US president, and it takes as clear-eyed view of the global challenges that are emerging as it can, so that the president is briefed on the global situation. You'll see there that the subtitle to the 2021 report was A More Contested World, and it highlights many of the same factors that I'll talk about in terms of the period from now till 2040 or 2050. That sits alongside major geopolitical strategists, people like Helen Thompson at Cambridge or Peter Zeihan, who are all talking about similar changes in geopolitical outlook. Matched to that is the climate crisis. And what we're seeing is that the impacts of climate change, things like extreme weather events, droughts, rainfalls, heat domes, etc., are happening at far lower global average temperature shifts than we had expected from our models. This will mean that the economic priority will, I think, necessarily shift from mitigation towards adaptation between now and 2040. Unfortunately, local always trumps global when it comes to political decisions around where to invest. And if we're faced with the prospect of reinforcing seawalls around major cities versus investing in upgrading our built environment infrastructure, we will probably choose to build seawalls, I think, because there are very particular points of immediate and obvious constraint. This is just something that came out of one of the authors of the IPCC Sixth Assessment Report, Working Group 3, which is on adaptation. And it basically is saying that that IPCC report is clearly flagging that the impacts of climate change are exceeding what we would have expected for this degree of warming. The third one is the demographic crisis. So essentially the ratio of those who are not in work, so those before working age and after retirement age, to those that are in work is rising very rapidly. So there are fewer economically active people in society supporting the requirements of the state and the burdens that those who are not working place on the state. And we're particularly seeing that in terms of burgeoning healthcare costs in aging societies, where it costs a lot to support people into old age, matched with the fact that those people who are older are more likely to be politically active. And so it's hard to take decisions which systemically disadvantage those. And we saw that in COVID. We globally prioritized the needs of people who are older and therefore more vulnerable over those people who are younger and will have to pay for COVID-induced debt. So that has an impact on global productivity and starts to generate intergenerational tensions. And this is looking at a couple of the demographic profiles from the United Nations work on demography. We'll come back to these, but the one on the right is what we imagine China will look like in 2050. And you can see there that China is facing one of the most rapidly aging populations in human history, and will have far fewer people who are economically active to support those who are economically inactive by the time we get to 2050. The fourth is the epistemic crisis, and this is one that is probably least familiar to many of you, but effectively the growth of social and synthetic media have and will continue to substantially erode liberal democracy's capacity to reach social consensus. At the same time, the authoritarian or autocratic control of social media that we see in many countries actually can help strengthen autocratic states' capacity to control the social consensus and narrative. So these factors are playing out very differently between liberal democratic countries and those who are willing to control access to social media and state media. Again, another essential must read is Jonathan Haidt's article, Why the past 10 years of American life have been uniquely stupid. He goes through the arguments about the impact of the advertising-driven social media model, which basically monetizes attention, and the impact that has had on creating divisions within a range of Western democratic societies. So that's the nutshell. That's basically the headwinds that are emerging that we're pushing against. I'll talk through each of these in a bit more detail. So our global unipolar moment, which the global geodemographic geopolitical analysts describe basically as being from 1989 at the fall of the Berlin Wall through to 2016, 2017 with the election of Donald Trump and Brexit in the UK. That was a period of almost unprecedented global consensus. It was the time that Francis Fukuyama famously declared the end of history at the beginning of this, and we had a period of kind of unipolar viewpoints, or where others were at least substantially repressed, even if they didn't agree with the Western liberal democratic order. So that's the global unipolar moment. Now, as it happens, we had our first COP in Berlin back in '95. We had the Paris COP in 2018 or 19, I think. No, actually it was 2016 in Paris. And that coincided almost entirely with this global unipolar moment. The challenge with that is that effectively that was probably going to be the best period in history to achieve a major global consensus on an issue like climate change. And we've kind of conspicuously failed to bend the curve in terms of global emissions over that period. So if we're moving into a period which is more multipolar, reaching consensus is likely to get more difficult rather than less. And the International Energy Agency, IRENA, and the UN Climate Change High-Level Champions have just published a report that says exactly this. So the IEA's report on net zero by 2050, they say that with low international cooperation, we are unlikely to achieve net zero before about 2090, and that in doing so, we will substantially increase the costs of delivering a net zero world. So their assumptions in the 2050 report are based effectively on a continuation of a capacity to reach a global consensus and act around issues like climate change. But we are seeing increases in multipolarity, or really bipolarity. So that creates challenges for energy security, for climate obligations, and we expect to see energy and climate will become geopolitical cards on the table. We've clearly seen that with Russia, that is weaponizing energy. We've also recently seen it with China suspending climate talks after Nancy Pelosi visited Taiwan. So it's becoming one of the cards in the geopolitical struggles. If you're unfamiliar with it, this is the Shanghai Cooperation Organisation. It was set up as a counterparty, if you like, a counterpoint to the OECD. It has basically grown and continues to grow. And as we've seen from a recent summit, they had, we've got Xi Jinping saying China is willing to make efforts with Russia to assume the role of great powers. We've seen a lot of interest from the Middle East in joining this organization. So Iran and Turkey also observer status to countries like Saudi Arabia. So they're increasing trade relations. We're seeing that on the wake of the Russian invasion of Ukraine with those countries who are accepting Russian oil. We've just had Xi Jinping say at the summit of the CCP that that he sees severe and complex international situations emerging, and that the CCP must be prepared for dangers in peacetime as well as preparing for the storm. So their worldview is not one of greater global cooperation. Looking at the impact of the climate. So, as I said earlier, climate models seem to be systemically underestimating the measurable impacts of warming. And that's coming directly from the latest IPCC AR6 report on impacts, adaptation, and vulnerability. We've seen this come out in completely unexpected climate events, things like the heat domes that we had initially over parts of China, but we've also seen that over India. That led to India banning wheat exports after the heat wave. We're also seeing absolutely unprecedented levels of drought across southern China. So the water levels are the lowest in recorded history. They are having widespread crop failures, and their grain stockpiles are at record lows because of the impacts of climate change. So we're getting a bringing together of climate events that are much more geographically localized and intense, feeding into implications for food availability, but also having implications for refugee movements around the world. So each of these is exacerbating issues like food price inflation and the various forms of refugee and famine crises. From the demographic crisis perspective, this is the graph I showed you in miniature previously. So we're seeing on the right the United Nations Population Division projections of the demographic structure of the Chinese population. We know this is an absolutely major issue for the attention of the CCP at the moment. But you can see there the fact that various policies have resulted in the most rapidly aging population in global history. There will be quite few people of working age trying to support a large number of people of non-working age. This is on top of the situation where a lot of people have moved away from traditional sort of nuclear family structures in China, with people moving into cities to try and earn income, basically. So there's a lot of social disruption that will come. China is just one case. The situation is worse in other countries, but it's acute in China. It's also particularly bad in many parts of Europe. The areas it's less bad are in areas of Africa and other parts of Asia, not so bad in America as well due to immigration issues. So Peter Zeihan, he's a geopolitical strategist who looks at the intersection of demographics and population dynamics, says that basically because industrialization has been time staggered and is accelerating, and it took the UK a long time to industrialize because it was the first to do so, but we're seeing industrialization now occurring within a generation in many parts of the world. Basically that we will have this problem of mass retirements and population crashes all becoming coincident in the 2020s. Now he is less optimistic than I am, if that's possible, but he's basically saying that the 2020s and 2030s are where this demographic collapse starts to really bite economically. And he's saying that when you combine the breakup of globalization with the demographics embedded in countries, that there will be no new mass consumption systems, and that we're looking at a world in which fewer resources are basically being shared by competing powers. So that's going to lead to a big change in the way the world is economically structured. The fourth one is the epistemic crisis. Again, to quote here from Jonathan Haidt, so social scientists have identified that effectively there are three or more forces binding successful democracies. So there is social capital, extensive social networks with high levels of trust. There are strong institutions and there are shared stories. And we are seeing social media in its current format basically undermining all three of those in liberal democratic countries. So we have a strange situation where surveillance capitalism, a term that was made famous by Zuboff, I think, I've forgotten her first name, but she basically wrote a book on surveillance capitalism, which talks about how the social media companies monopolize attention and turn it into advertising revenue, and that basically annoying people and aggravating people is the single best way to engage them. So basically the algorithms in these companies that push social media posts in front of viewers prioritize ones that make people likely to react and engage. There's a saying that enragement is engagement, and essentially they build algorithms to enrage people to make sure that they engage with their platforms. The opposite of that is happening in authoritarian areas. If you're unfamiliar with the Xi Jinping Thought app, so this is an app that the 100 million members of the Chinese Communist Party and people working in government in China must download and must interact with on a daily basis. It's basically providing them with Xi Jinping's thoughts about China. They have to complete quizzes, and their their scores on tests on their capacity to absorb Xi Jinping thought are recorded by their employers. They can also win bonuses for doing well. There are also lots of reports of basically employers or in universities, people being publicly shamed for not scoring sufficiently highly on the app. So these forces are pulling in completely opposite directions. And that is going to make reaching social consensus on issues in Western democratic countries increasingly challenging under the current advertising-based social media model. The other change here is synthetic media. If you're unfamiliar with the term, that is basically the construction of media using artificial intelligence. We're seeing a lot of this now, where basically disinformation can be generated industrially by artificial intelligence. This is now being done, and essentially people are setting up websites generated with content entirely generated by various AI systems, purely for the purposes of attracting engagement from people and generating revenue for that site through advertising, so that they can win advertising financing from social media companies. But their model is purely to generate whatever content is as realistic as possible, but completely synthetic. So we get to a stage where there's a risk that effectively you get industrial generation of misinformation. And there are actors in the world that are engaged in this process now, particularly Russia. So that's the global situation. The European picture. So it's looking like we are heading into a period of stagflation. I would suspect probably through to the late 2020s. We have post-COVID supply chain constraints. We have significant workforce productivity constraints because of ill health and retirement. So we have a mixture of inflation and factors suppressing economic productivity. We are in a situation where governments are motivated to what's called inflate away COVID debt. If you have a large debt, you've basically got three options. You can default on that debt. You can have a highly productive economy which generates a lot of income and can pay down the debt, or you can run inflation at above growth rates, and that erodes the debt over time. So governments that are carrying large COVID and now energy debts in Europe, whilst not wanting to admit it, have a motivation to allow inflation to run ahead of economic growth to help lower that debt burden. We also, so that inflation that we're importing, we're creating locally, but also globally, is leading to stagflation. And this is going to have basically the fueling of populism. And we're already seeing that in European elections. Once we start talking about resilience, and there's a big focus on reshoring supply chains to make them less vulnerable to, initially the pandemic, but also shocks from the Ukraine conflict. Doing that increases costs without increasing productivity. So resilience is inherently inflationary. We offshored because we could do things cheaper. Reshoring it has the opposite effect. So that reinforces the inflationary spiral. We have a food crisis like no other. To cite the UN World Food Programme, there has never been a food crisis like we're in at the moment. That will also drive refugee influxes. So it's a perfect storm of conflict, climate, COVID, and inflationary costs. we are seeing what the UN calls a ring of fire, which is essentially a ring of countries around the equator that are all suffering from food price inflation and various forms of migration. So that's basically driving impacts into neighboring countries. Again, wide-scale refugee migration fuels populist backlashes in many neighboring countries. And we have the energy crisis, which is the one that you will all be most familiar with. So we have done a lot, and it's been impressive to see how Europe has reduced its reliance on Russian gas and oil. But the test comes this winter, and it will be interesting to see how public support for the support of Ukraine is maintained during the course of the winter, particularly if it's a cold winter. But again, the costs of doing this have been very high, and so this is adding to government debt burdens. But it also has a knock-on effect on fertilizers, because basically gas production also fuels fertilizer production. So we're seeing price inflation in the food supply chains. And economic sanctions are basically restructuring political relations. So this is reinforcing the multipolar world and pushing Russia towards towards partnerships with other states other than Europe. We have seen inflation rising. As you're aware, these figures are slightly out of date. This is back to March, but the situation hasn't improved significantly. Again, this is OECD figures, with it rising to about 8.8%. That is seeing real terms reduction in living standards across a lot, in fact, most of the OECD. From the energy point of view, again, this is something we are now reasonably familiar with. We've been very successful in removing a lot of this reliance, but in doing so, we've moved to heavy reliance on importation of LNG, which is a global market, which means those countries previously reliant on LNG imports are facing far higher prices. So again, it's global knock-on effects of global energy systems. I won't dwell on this slide because I think those on this call are most likely to be familiar with this. The refugee crisis, we are seeing, we've seen Ukraine mean that we've got over 7.2 million refugees that are coming across into Europe since February. We have on our southern borders the Yemen emergency, which again is seeing fewer people entering Europe, but increasing the pressure on migration that we've seen previously and caused a lot of political problems in Europe. Syria, again, one of the major ones where we've seen 6.6 million people who have moved into countries outside of Syria who are being housed. And the same applies to Sahel, Afghans. So again, they've got 5.7 million people in neighboring countries. So each of these is causing pressure for migration and refugee influxes into Europe, in the European case, but also into neighboring countries. And these are expensive things for countries to accommodate. This, in part, of course, is part of what is intended with the Russian war on energy. So this was a quote from a senior European diplomat in the Financial Times. But essentially, the game is obviously that Putin is wanting to divide Europe, and to do that by picking off countries systematically. And he will do that using a range of tactics. So we've heard recent talk about false flag operations of dirty bombs. We don't know where this will go, but the combination of energy constraints, the prospect of some form of radiation fallout from potential nuclear material coming across Europe will test European resolve substantially. We've already seen this starting to manifest. So Mario Draghi said at the start of the Ukraine conflict, do you want peace or do you want air conditioning? It's very clear that Italians want air conditioning. We've seen a swing to the right with the recent election in Italy. We've seen a swing to the right in Sweden, of all places. So we would probably expect, as we get worsening economic conditions, increasing influx of refugees, and increasing impacts from climate anomalies, that we will see a shift towards populism across Europe. And it'll be interesting to see how this plays out. But this will, in some ways, I think, play into those who are looking to put pressure on Europe to be disunited on energy in Ukraine. But I would expect this to continue. So in March, I basically sat down and said what might be a reasonable worst case scenario. The first time I started thinking about this was in March, recently after the invasion of Ukraine. This is what I had at that time. I got some things clearly wrong. So the first one is that land gas pipelines across Ukraine and Belarus would be destroyed. In fact, we've seen the destruction of Nord Stream pipeline. So that wasn't what was expected. But a lot of these other things have unfortunately come to pass. So Putin has basically cut supplies and will deny supply to Europe through winter. That's led to a whole lot of things that were potentially reasonably predictable. We are likely to see this extensive energy rationing. There's plans for it across Europe. And we'll see a fairly sharp economic turndown across many European countries, and a reinvestment in hydrocarbons, which we're seeing again in many states. So unfortunately, much of what looked possible as a reasonable worst case scenario in March has come to pass. I also put down in March this kind of scenario for 2023 to 25. Now, I think I still would stand by most of this. It is in certainly the US's and others' interests to see the Ukraine conflict drain Russia of its capacity for aggression. So we're likely to see that conflict continue. And it's certainly the pattern of Russian conflicts in Syria and elsewhere, that they become long, drawn-out, protracted affairs. The West will continue to support Ukraine. It'll be interesting the extent to which European countries do after winter. But we will see this play out into economic recessions, etc. The consequences for the transition is things will slow. And that's going to be partly because of economic constraints, partly because under stress, countries fall back on what is familiar. And we have a familiarity with the use of hydrocarbons. It's not the right solution. I think it's completely wrong, but I think it's still likely to happen. We will also face material constraints on the acceleration of the energy transition. And the IEA is doing a lot of excellent work around looking at basically rare earths and others, and how we secure those supply chains. We will see populism rising. As I've mentioned, we will see stagflation across Europe. And we will see a shift away from decarbonisation as a priority. We're already seeing a lot of the rhetoric online shift towards energy security as a rationale for continuing on with hydrocarbon-based energy systems. And a lot of stuff is trying to be pinned on the energy transition. That will lead through to basically a rebalancing of the energy trilemma. Somebody pointed out when I first gave this, the priority has always been energy security, then affordability, then decarbonisation. But we had taken the first, certainly the first, and in large measure the first and second for granted. So our focus was really on decarbonisation. We're now looking really at solutions which prioritize security through reshoring of a lot of our energy generation and diversifying that across sources, and affordability, which we've seen as a priority for all governments. That is necessary, but it will mean decarbonisation takes a backseat to those. I think it might also mean that there's a risk that complex market-based solutions may be seen as too risky. We have run just-in-time supply chains and allowed markets to drive down costs, but that has also led us into situations of energy dependency on Russia, which they've been very happy to promote. So we will certainly see more government intervention in the structure of the energy market and less of a free hand for purely market-driven solutions. I touched on this previously, so we're going to see, I think, that issues around climate and energy will become part of a wider geopolitical struggle around different perspectives. So security will start to become dominant as part of the broader question of economic and military security. Decarbonisation will become energy independence or energy resilience. We will see low carbon material supply chains also become political levers. So I think we will see that in terms of China, which is currently dominant in those. We've seen the US tackle China over high-tech chip manufacture. We're likely to see management of critical minerals in return, I think. So I think that we will see a drive for increase in distributed energy resources, but we might also see a reduction in the willingness for nations and geographic areas to allow those resources to participate. So we might see less acceptance of things like interconnectors as solutions we rely on and want to reshore much of that. The energy transition is going to be a lot tougher than we thought. As I've mentioned, I think we're going to remain with highly volatile energy prices. I think most of the markets and the economic pundits are saying that that's likely to be locked in until we can really substantially transition away from hydrocarbons. We will see attempts by hydrocarbon-dependent economies to weaken the strength of that transition. And I think we have seen that through OPEC Plus actions recently. So OPEC Plus defied the US to try and maintain high prices. So there's a lot of geopolitics in this. So I think understanding people's perceptions and response to price volatility will become important. I think the psychology of the perception of future risk is going to become hugely important in how we frame the energy transition. and how we think about what strategies may allow us to increase acceptance of that, partly through decreasing the risk of future volatile prices. We have seen, and we will continue to see, the debate around climate change become more fractious. So I think there is a real need here to focus on the construction of trust and maintaining coherent social narratives around affordability and equity. If we lose the debate that the energy transition is one that will be equitable, I think we will lose the capacity to have public support for the transition. Now, I think it's a separate issue around, there's two ways to look at questions of equity. One is an end in itself, and one is a necessary condition for delivering decarbonisation. And it's the latter that I'm thinking about in this context. We will need it to maintain the capacity to act in democratic countries. We will have to essentially we will have to address adaptation as well as mitigation. My money is that we're heading towards a +3 to 4 degree world. I think in that kind of scenario, everything we do must assume a far greater stress on energy and energy systems, including built environments, than we currently see. So we need to be able to withstand that stress as well as mitigate the emissions. So balancing those will become much more important than it does under assumptions of, say, a 1.5 degree world. I think we will increasingly see governments looking to find what you might call silver bullet solutions, ranging from nuclear fusion, space-based solar, all of these things. We already have assumptions about carbon, net negative carbon technologies built into our reports to help us meet climate targets. But I think this will increase. There is, as a colleague of mine pointed out, there's a risk that countries will act unilaterally around issues of geoengineering, which could be utterly disastrous. So we need to understand where people sit with respect to understanding high risk, high reward solutions and how they would play out politically. We need something that looks at climate security and resilience. We're seeing this in all of the discussions that I'm now involved with at IEA and elsewhere. Resilience and security are really becoming the keywords that will shape what the transition looks like. We might need to trade off efficiency for the capacity to keep operating under a wide range of conditions. And again, users' perceptions of risk is totally important here to how they will accept the costs associated with building resilient systems. I think regulation will become more important, not less important, and partly because I think there will be a withdrawal from reliance on markets at the government level because of these issues outlined earlier. So I think that understanding the role of regulation and what is socially acceptable regulation and how that is framed and how we maintain trust in governments is going to be absolutely essential. I think we will see very rapid electrification. And I think as a consequence of that, we will see issues of demand's response, flexibility, sort of coming up to being as important or possibly economically more attractive than looking at energy efficiency. We have struggled to deliver straight energy efficiency outside of straight policy areas. But I think the market-based solutions will really focus around questions of delivering flexibility, capacity into decarbonized systems. I think that a lot of what we call the heavy lifting, the big money, is going to have to come out of the private sector again, but it's going to be really hard to build business cases because everything is going to be in flux. So I think the capacity to predict where value will be created in the system, for how long and how much value, will be central to building the business cases which can actually deliver the transitions. And we've got various tools we can deliver here, like digital twins and ways of sustaining user engagement. So that capacity to do that will be absolutely central to working out where business fits into this jigsaw puzzle. Thank you. That's the end. I'm going to, at this point, I think, hand over to Sam to briefly say something about the users TCP before we move into the Q&A session. So Sam, I think it's over to you.
Thank you, David. Unrelentingly optimistic as usual. That was a great presentation. Thanks very much. Look, so David is the chair of the User-Centered Energy Systems Technology Collaboration Program. But as he said, he's not speaking on behalf of it today. My job as the leader of the secretariat of the organization is just to tell you a little bit about who we are and also how you could get involved. And we are always open to particularly people from the policy, industry, or indeed research communities to get involved with our work. So we operate under the auspices of the International Energy Agency, but we are independent of them, and there are 39 technology collaboration programs, of which we are one. Most of the others deal with a particular technology type, so it might be like heat pumping technologies, for example, or solar thermal, or it might be a particular sector of the energy system, like buildings and communities, for example. We're a little bit different. There are a few TCPs that have a sort of more cross-cutting remit. Our remit is to do socio-technical research, so essentially marrying technical analysis with research from the social sciences. And it's that intersection that we bring to the table in the understanding that policy can be made better when these two elements are combined. So what do we do? Well, our 15 member countries basically collaborate to undertake research, international collaborative research, and we call these tasks. You can see 6 of the tasks that we've undertaken or are undertaking at the moment in the TCP. They range from things that are at the sort of more social policy end. So the Behavioral Insights platform, for example, looks to take the lessons from behavioral research and apply that to energy policy problems. To the more technical end, so David's institute at UCL is one of the organizations, indeed the lead organization in our peer-to-peer energy trading global observatory, which brings together analysis of the various pilot programs that are being undertaken around the world to draw lessons for them, particularly for the policymakers that make up our executive committee from our 15 member countries. We use the Academy to basically provide a dissemination opportunity for our tasks, but also for people that are engaged or national experts on our tasks, or indeed are members of our executive committee like David. So if you would like to get involved with the research that we undertake, then you can get in touch with me either by going to our website, www.userstcp.org, and going to the contact button, or by emailing me direct, and I'll put my email address in the chat box. As I said, we're very interested in researchers joining our collaborations, or indeed if you're a policymaker in a member in a country that is yet to be a member of the TCP, then we'd be very happy to talk to you about how you could get involved. So with that, I'm going to hand back to our host, Fernando, and just say to you all, if you have a question for David, then please put it in the Q&A box, and we'll move through the questions in the remainder of the time we have available. Thanks very much.